The night Zurich froze time, nothing collapsed. No market closed. No announcement was made. Yet for a few critical hours, the flow of global finance slowed as if someone had pressed pause. In Zurich, time did not stop, but it was deliberately restrained. To understand why this night mattered, we need to look at how modern finance depends on uninterrupted motion. Payments clear continuously. Positions roll automatically. Liquidity moves across borders in milliseconds. Stability is not just about value. It is about flow. And when flow is interrupted, even briefly, consequences ripple far beyond the place where the pause began. The story begins late in the day, when signals started converging. Volatility was rising across markets, but not violently. Funding remained available, but conditions were tightening unevenly. Algorithms reacted faster than institutions could assess. The risk was not insolvency. It was acceleration. Inside Switzerland's financial infrastructure, alarms were not flashing red. They were flashing amber. Settlement volumes were surging. Timing mismatches were growing. Too many transactions were trying to clear at once, each depending on the next. The system was safe, but fragile in sequence. Swiss authorities recognized the pattern immediately. This was not a crisis that required rescue. It was a moment that required interruption. Allowing everything to proceed at full speed risked forcing automated reactions into feedback loops no one could control once triggered. The decision was not to shut markets. That would have signaled panic. Instead, something subtler happened. Processes were slowed. Windows were adjusted. Certain operations were delayed just long enough to break simultaneity. Time itself became the tool. Participants did not notice at first. Transactions still cleared. Prices still updated. But the pace changed. The rush eased. The pressure diffused. What could have cascaded instead settled. Zurich had not frozen markets. It had frozen synchronization. By interrupting timing rather than value, it prevented a moment of stress from turning into a systemic event. That night revealed a truth rarely acknowledged. In systems built for speed, the ability to slow down, quietly, deliberately, and without announcement, can be the most powerful form of control. And once time was released again, the system moved on, unaware of how close it had come to outrunning itself. As the slowdown took effect, behavior changed almost immediately. Algorithms recalibrated. Margin calls spaced out. Settlement queues shortened. The system did not retreat. It reorganized itself around the new tempo. Inside banks, treasury desks felt the shift before they understood it. Liquidity pressure eased without any additional funding. Positions that looked strained minutes earlier became manageable once timing stopped compressing decisions. Space returned, not in balance sheets, but in sequence. What made the intervention effective was invisibility. No rule was announced. No threshold was crossed publicly. Participants were not told to slow down. They were given conditions that made slowing down natural. In complex systems, nudging rhythm is often safer than issuing commands. Clearinghouses played their role quietly. Margin calculations adjusted cadence. Settlement priorities were reordered. None of these changes altered obligations. They altered when obligations had to be met. That distinction prevented forced reactions that would have fed on themselves. Regulators elsewhere noticed the calm spreading outward. Stress indicators stabilized across borders. Funding costs stopped rising. What had begun as a local timing adjustment rippled into a continental reset of pace. Zurich had bought time, not just for itself, but for everyone connected to it. The danger passed without headlines. Markets closed as usual. Positions rolled overnight without incident. By morning, conditions looked normal again. Only those inside the system understood how close acceleration had come to breaking coordination. The night Zurich froze time demonstrated a form of authority rarely discussed. Control over rhythm can matter more than control over resources. When systems move too fast, stability is restored not by adding liquidity, but by reintroducing sequence. No investigation followed. No lessons were announced. But inside policy circles, the message was clear. In a world optimized for speed, the ability to slow processes deliberately is a form of resilience. And that resilience will be needed again, Because modern finance does not fail from lack of capital alone. It fails when time itself runs out. The real significance of that night only became clear afterward. Nothing dramatic had happened, and that was precisely the problem. Without a visible crisis, there was no public validation of the choice to slow time. Yet internally, the implications were impossible to ignore. Risk managers replayed the sequence carefully. The system had not been underfunded. It had been over-synchronized. Too many actions were scheduled to occur at once, driven by models optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. The pause had not changed fundamentals. It had changed outcomes. Banks revised internal assumptions quietly. Stress scenarios began to include timing compression rather than just price shock. Liquidity planning expanded beyond access to include sequencing. The question shifted from whether assets were liquid to whether they could be mobilized without forcing everyone else to act simultaneously. Clearing and settlement infrastructures took note as well. Design conversations moved toward flexibility instead of speed alone. Redundancy was reconsidered. Friction, once treated as inefficiency, was reframed as protection against runaway alignment. Regulators across Europe studied the episode without referencing it publicly. The lesson was uncomfortable. Traditional safeguards had worked exactly as designed, yet still risked collision through simultaneity. Stability had been preserved not by strength, but by restraint. What Zurich demonstrated was that modern crises often form the gaps between systems, not within them. No single institution was weak. No rule was broken, but alignment had become too tight, leaving no room for error. The night did not expose a flaw in regulation. It exposed a blind spot in design philosophy. Speed had been treated as progress, efficiency as safety. That night proved otherwise. Time, once seen as neutral, revealed itself as a variable that could either stabilize or destabilize the entire system. And control over time, when exercised carefully, became a form of systemic insurance. The pause had passed, but its implications lingered, reshaping how Europe would think about stress long after the clocks resumed their normal pace. The changes that followed were subtle but enduring. Systems were not slowed permanently. They were made adjustable. Flexibility was built into processes that had once been rigidly optimized. Speed remained a strength, but no longer the only one. European infrastructure evolved with timing in mind. Settlement windows gained elasticity. Margin mechanisms incorporated pacing. Stress tests modeled what happens when everything tries to move at once. Time became a dimension of risk, not just a backdrop. Institutions adjusted culture as well. Decisions were no longer judged solely by efficiency. The ability to pause became a skill. Leaders learned that restraint under pressure could prevent larger interventions later. Control was redefined as influence over rhythm, not command over outcomes. The night Zurich froze time did not become legend. It became doctrine, quietly absorbed, rarely referenced, but deeply influential. It changed how authorities viewed the relationship between speed and stability. The lesson traveled beyond Switzerland. In a system where milliseconds matter, deliberate delay can be decisive. Markets do not always need more money. Sometimes they need more time. That understanding did not eliminate future stress. It changed how stress was met. Instead of racing to respond, the system learned when to slow itself down. And that may be the most modern form of resilience. Not strength alone, not liquidity alone, but the capacity to interrupt momentum before it becomes uncontrollable. In the end, Zurich did not stop the clock. It reminded Europe that time, when handled carefully, can save an entire system. Subscribe to join the journey. The night